Hi guys, I'm Gina and welcome back to my studio. I've managed to finish this little project, which is sort of doors from Paris. I don't know, just call it something, right? And this was the first time I've done it, and it was a bit of an experimentation piece, trying to get the brickwork or the stonework to look reasonably authentic, but I'm actually keen to give this another go with a different type of style and just see what the learnings that I can take from it, because the stonework, while it's got the detail around it, looks really more like soft pillows. I don't know, it doesn't really look like soft pillows, but that's the closest I can describe it, and it doesn't have the crisp, clean lines that you would find from stone, so I'm going to try and do that today. The other thing that I did, and I know this already, but I used a blunt blade when I was cutting around the door frame, so then I had to use some filler to fill in the gaps as well. Anyway, let's try and not do that today, and what I'm going to try and do is, I've got one couple of round windows, but they're actually on the door, but for the foam, I'm just going to try and keep it reasonably square, just see if that makes any difference. I've got some other ideas for embellishments as well, just to try and bring it to life and to give it a little bit more character. But ultimately, I was pretty happy with how this has turned out. I think it looks pretty good. I will link the video to this one in the description as well. So let's see what I can come up with today, and let's get started. So I've got my foam sheets as well as the plan and the little details there which I've created out of hot glue and a silicone mold. If you want to know more about that, check out the the first video. Go into a little bit more detail around that. So to begin with, I'm just going to draw out the plan, and then I'm going to use my very sharp blade and cut out the foam to the shape that I'm needing. So to add in a little bit more detail, I'm just adding some extra foam board at the bottom. I'm adding a piece at the top as well, and then I'm just cutting these pieces for the corbels, which is sort of the stone brackets type structures at the top of the wall. So I'm just cutting these to size. Obviously that piece wasn't meant to go all the way across, and then I'm just cutting that down to make room for the piece of foam. So now I'm just going to put in the details, which is just cutting through that top, very, very top layer of the foam, and then going back through with a pencil, and just remembering to come around the side to bring the grout lines around the side to give the illusion of stone. One thing I realised is that the foam board being 5mm thick, it's just a bit too thick for the level of detail that I wanting to put on here. So I've just cut that down in half, and now I'm just gluing these pieces in place. So moving on to shaping the corbels, I've just glued two pieces of that foam board together, and I've created a bit of a pattern along the side just to kind of give it a little bit of a larger scroll effect at the top, and then coming down quite narrow at the bottom. So I'm just using a very sharp blade, very carefully. I can see that they're cutting this quite close to my fingers, but I promise you I was cutting this very, very slowly, and just trying to shape it out and just carving it out as if it was to look like stone as much as possible. Then once I'm happy with the overall shape of it, I'm just going to take off the very edges, just to kind of give it that carved stone look, and it just sort of softens the whole look of them as well, so that it's not just looking like two pieces of foam board stuck together. So this starts to now bring a little bit more character into it as well, and then I just also take off the very edges of it as well, just so that again that it doesn't look so square and boxy. And then taking the pencil, this is the same pencil I've used for the other pieces of stonework, I'm just going to start adding in some extra details. So I want to create sort of some details coming down the very face of it, because that's, you're going to be looking straight at it. And then I'm also going to add in some details across the side of it as well. Actually, when I was doing this, when I've slowly put it together, these pieces that I'm doing right here, I've just sort of freehanded them to whatever this particular shape would suit. But when I actually put them into the project, they match perfectly up with the line of the grout lines at the top. I was quite amazed. Anyway, so yeah, just putting in some details on the side. Not really going to see this that much, but I just wanted to just put it a little bit in there. Could have probably done this a lot more and cut out more of the foam, and I guess if I was doing it again, I'd really like to try and emphasize the scroll effect in here. But this seemed to work reasonably well, and I was pretty happy with how it turned out. So now it's time to glue them into place, and I don't know if you can actually see it from here, but you can see that that bottom part of the corbel lines very nicely up with that grout line. That was an absolute fluke. It would have been absolutely fine if it didn't line up. You know, it doesn't have to, but the fact that it did, I was pretty stoked with that. So yeah, just gluing these now into place, and then going to put that aside to let that dry. So for the base coat, I've just mixed up a reasonably warm, light tan sort of colour. It almost looks peach there, doesn't it? And I'm just really wanting this to show through, because again, I'm wanting to create more of a sandstone effect, and I'm just sort of following a very similar process to the last project, but using this sort of yellow colour as well as the sort of rust red, and just sort of sparingly kind of sponge that onto the project, so I'm not too worried about full coverage. This is really just to add a few highlights, and hopefully that they will start to show through. Won't be immediately seen, but you definitely will start to see those come through. And then just adding white to the base coat, and just putting on layers. So you can either use a dry brush effect. I personally preferred this one, which is more of a stippling effect, and putting on layer upon layer. I do go back and put a slightly grayer tinge to the final coat, just to take out some of that warmth in the colour, because it was really starting to show through. So after a couple of coats of that stippling effect, I've mixed up a mixture of brown and black, just to soften the black just slightly, and with water, so just to create a bit of a wash. And then I'm just going to dab that through with a bit of a paper towel, and then I realised that I've probably taken off too much, but I'm just going to go back through and just touch up those grout lines slightly. So moving on to creating the doors. Actually, through this process I kind of went backwards and forwards, but I just sort of thought for the video it might be easier if I group them together. So for the doors, I'm just cutting out 2 layers of mat board, so it's 1mm thick mat board, and I'm going to do this in a couple of layers. So the first layer is going to be basically the door frame, and I am then going to use the second layer for some additional details. This will really help give the illusion of depth into the project. So once I've marked out all of the project, I am now going to move on to cutting out the circles. So luckily with the mat board it's a little bit more forgiving, and I can just go through that and just move the actual project around the knife rather than the knife around the project. Hopefully that makes sense. And now I can move on to creating the details onto the doors. So this is just to create the panels on the doors, and I'm just using some thin strips of mat board, cut at a 45 degree at either end, and then I'm just going to work my way around the 2 panels at the bottom, as well as the panels that go around the round windows. And so now for some teeny tiny details. This is actually a toothpick, and I'm just very carefully cutting off, oh, it's probably a millimetre off the end of it, and then these are going to create the little rivets around the window. I didn't have enough space to actually put a frame around the window as well, but I was really looking for just some of the details that I could add into the project to make it look as much like the inspiration piece as possible. So just adding in some more details. This is the strip that goes down between the doors, and so this actually adds another layer of detail, as well as some additional pieces that I'm going to create to go above the door. So once those pieces are all glued together, I'm just going to start with the painting, and this paint is actually very thin. So I do go back after a couple of coats, and then I add in some black into it as well, just to kind of give it some depth of colour. Although I must say here it's starting to look a little bit like a phone box or the TARDIS, but we kind of get around that. So once that's dry, or pretty much dry, I'll actually go over with a black, just a straight black wash to, you know, add in some extra details, and then I just sort of mop up any excess with a paper towel. But one thing I do realise that after this is sort of sat for a moment or two is that the paint obviously wasn't as dry as what I thought it was, and if you can see there, it's just started to bubble at the very bottom, just where the water had been sitting. So I'm actually going to use this to my advantage, and I'm actually going to brush that away to create the scuff marks along the bottom of the door, or wherever that water had been sitting. That's going to add that level of detail. So there's a little bit up around the top and at the very top of the door as well. So one little mistake can turn into actually a happy accident. So to create the door handles, what I'm going to do is take some wire, and I'm just going to twist that round on itself a couple of times, and then I'm just going to snip them apart to create some little loops. And then I've got, this was actually quite difficult to do, but we got there in the end. So there's one. I actually made 3 even though I only needed 2, but it's better to have a spare. And then I've just got some sort of jewellery leftover pieces. I'm not too sure what you'd call them. They were from a beaded necklace, which I took apart to get the beads out, and this was sort of what was left over. But they make perfect little holders for the rings, which I can now attach to the doors. Before I do that, however, I'm just going to paint them with some gold paint, because these are actually silver. I wish I had some gold or brass wire, that would have been ideal, but you know, you use what you've got. And then just for the kick plate at the bottom, I've just used some brown, some burnt umber paint, along with a little bit of metallic bronze, just to kind of give that a bit of a look. And then just before I put these pieces in, which is the top blade of the fan, so I used the middle part of the fan in the previous project, so I just kept these pieces aside, and I'm just doing a little bit of a dry brush of white on them just to highlight some of those details. And then I'm also just going over the doors as well, just highlighting the edges of all of the pieces on there, just to make them pop, which definitely makes a bit of a difference. So now it's time to put it all together. I created the footpath or the cobblestones just with a tissue box or a cereal box container, and I just cut out lots of little squares and just glued those into place on top of some mat board, and then we can start adding all the details in together. So this is a piece of cardstock that I've just covered with some sellotape just to give it that little bit of sheen, and then I'm just going to stick that into place just with some, well, this is just painter's tape, probably masking tape would be better. It will just keep it a little bit longer, but as you can see down the bottom I've also stuck down the handles just so that they don't twist around also. And then the final step is just adding in the little bollards just on either side of the doorway, just on the footpath, and then it's all done. So I really hope that you've enjoyed this video just as much as I've enjoyed pulling it together for you. And here is the final result. I am absolutely stoked with how this one has turned out also. And if you've liked this video, I've added in another one here that I think that you might like. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell notification. So thanks very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.